Hello, and today we'll be talking about effects of altitude on temperature and performance. To begin with, we're just going to talk about what happens to the body in heat compared to the cold. Um, and to start off, we're going to talk about thermal regulation. So in high temperatures, which is generally 25 degrees and up, temperature can have quite a massive effect on the body during exercise. Even without exercise, just to thermoregulate and keep the body temperature at a certain heat, the arterioles tend to vasodilate, and this is when arterioles expand, causing there to be a decrease in blood pressure, and also um, making the blood flow closer to the surface of the skin, so that the body can cool a lot more. Also, hair like skin hairs, like on your arms, legs, etc., tend to lay flat, and this is so that less air is trapped, um, so that the body doesn't warm up more, and there's also less blood working on that area, keep hairs up. Also, the sweat glands increase secretion in the body because they are trying to cool down body temperature by using sweat, which is basically water and salt, to cool down the body so that it doesn't overheat or so that core temperature doesn't rise too much. Of course, when exercising, um, the body can be affected quite majorly um, by high temperatures, and this can, like, things such as breathing rate will increase because the there'll be more demand for oxygen in the muscles, especially in the heat or just generally during exercises. So the breathing rate tends to increase a lot more. Um, there's also an increase in blood flow because the body focuses on cooling a lot more. So that would be another reason why blood would need to get around the body more, is because it actually has to focus on getting oxygen to certain parts of the body so that cooling can occur more quickly, um, so the body doesn't overheat. Also, there's a chance of VO2 max decreasing, and that's because the body isn't just focusing on the performance itself, it's also focusing on other mechanisms such as cooling, and keeping the body at a lower temperature. Also, um, humidity can affect cooling mechanisms. So if you're in quite a hot climate, such as the Caribbean or Egypt, for example, when it's more humid in those countries, it actually makes it's easier for the sweat to evaporate, or um, and it can affect the cooling mechanisms, so it makes it harder to sweat, which means that more blood will be needed to um, work the cooling mechanisms to produce even more sweat than originally. Of course, you can get hypothermia, which is when the body experiences higher temperatures than it normally would, causing the participant to feel very ill, um, and can have certain symptoms such as heat rash, heat exhaustion, and also heat stroke. There's also other effects that are quite expected during higher temperature conditions such as dehydration, and also it can affect different parts of the body. Like, for example, in the NBA basketball finals, um, when the Heat were playing San Antonio Spurs, the air conditioning went out, which made the arena go to almost 90 degrees. Um, in the arena, and even the great LeBron James was forced to sit out part of it because of cramps that were caused by the heat. Um, and there's also things such as high body temperature that can cause a decrease in blood flow to the heart. So if the heart doesn't get as much blood, that means it can't pump as much oxygenated blood back to the muscles, which may cause these cramps and cause fatigue a lot quicker, just generally. Now moving on to lower temperatures, um, basically quite a lot of the things that happen in the high temperature are just the opposite now. So, for example, the arterioles now vasoconstrict instead of vasodilate, which means that they come closer together. They don't expand, but they contract, causing it to be a higher blood pressure, um, and there's less blood flowing close to the surface of the skin, making it a lot easier to shiver. And shivering is done also to try to warm up the body. It's where the muscles try to kind of spasm or twitch so that more heat can be produced to increase core body temperature. Sweat glands will always also decrease secretion, so there won't be any sweating when you're cold, um, as the sweat only makes you cooler, which wouldn't be ideal and would cause the core temperature to go down even more. And during performance, there are many things that can affect performance in low temperature, such as metabolism can be affected, and this is because low temperatures tend to put a greater load on your metabolism, and as temperature falls, so does blood pressure increases, and blood is taken away from the skin surface, which increases the amount of blood in the core. This would put a lot of extra strain on the heart. So this means that the body would lose more heat and it has to work harder to maintain a stable temperature to generate more heat. This is why we do things like shiver, for example. Colder muscles are also less efficient, and when it takes a lot less time for muscles to cool back down to their original state once they've been warmed up, and this could definitely cause a lot more injuries, as the muscles can tend to be a bit less pliable in cooler conditions, as they can cool down quite quickly. Also, carbohydrates are used up a lot quicker generally in colder temperatures, which can be the preferred fuel for long distance runners as it's slow burning. And as energy consumption increases in colder conditions, so do these energy stores, which are used up a lot more quicker. Um, and therefore, you need to definitely eat a lot more before performance, just because they burn a lot quicker in colder conditions. And of course, hypothermia can occur, and this tends to happen when the body's core falls from about 35 degrees Celsius down to 37 degrees Celsius down to about 35 degrees or less, which is only a small drop. But there's some symptoms that may occur when experiencing hypothermia may be shivering, numb extremities, which can reduce a lot of dexterity, so like not being able to move around as much, and feeling really cold. These are the early effects. And then more things can even occur after that. For example, when you get to further stages of hypothermia, this is in extreme conditions, um, the heart rate tends to slow quite a lot and can even slow down to about 1 beat per minute. Also, the limbs are very stiff and the pupils can dilate quite wide, so it doesn't sound like an amazing experience. But other than that, um, we can take a look at what happens also, not in just temperature situations, but also in altitude. So we're going to take a look at high versus sea level. And in high altitude, there tends to be a lower partial pressure in the air, which means that there's less gas in the air, especially particles. which means that certain things like the Mexico City Olympics could have been affected, and I'll get to that in a second. There's also lower saturation in gases exchange, and this can be due to partial pressure, which means that less hemoglobin is getting associated during the gaseous exchange process. And then also athletes do this to help improve their performance. So they sleep high and train low, which I'll talk about later also. So when actually performing, high altitudes can have an effect on your performance. It can reduce the amount of red blood cells counted in the body, and this could be because there's less um, EPO available, and that's because of the low saturation in gaseous exchange. So that's why some athletes tend to sleep high and train low, because if they sleep high, that means, especially for endurance athletes, sleeping high can increase red blood cells and VO2 max. And it's proven that most, but not all, athletes living at high altitude and training at lower altitude can increase their speed and stamina, which is read in an article by Edmund Burke. High altitude training camps are also one of the ways that some professional athletes can experience the EPO benefits. So to do with the red blood cell count, and they can then see if they are benefiting from sleeping high and training low in their performance. And some ways they do this is by using a hypoxic tent, for example, which can create like an environment that's similar to high altitudes by reducing the oxygen content in the air, which isn't too expensive, and it's not as time consuming as traveling up and down mountains. Also, oxygen, because of all of these factors, oxygen is demanded more, which is going to definitely increase the participants' heart rate and breathing rate, as more oxygen is going to be needed a lot more quicker to get to working muscles. However, though, when comparing aerobic and anaerobic activities, in aerobic performance, all of those things that we just spoke about would be affected, but in anaerobic performance, because you don't need oxygen as much, it's not as affected and can actually be increased, and that's because there's less particles in the air, which is seen in the Mexico City Games, where the athletes, especially for the jumping events and the sprinting events and throwing events, all did way better than they normally did, because they have less particles to go through, which gives them a bit of extra edge in comparison to normal. Now, gaseous exchange, this isn't a process that occurs to get oxygen and hemoglobin associated and dissociated. So this occurs during exercise at rest at quite a standard rate, and the saturation at rest would be 100%, and then it would go through the process of going into leaving the high pressure to the low pressure and going into the bloodstream, fully associated, getting into the muscle, and would only have to use one pair of oxygen, and then would go back to the blood, to the heart, to get reassociated, leaving it at 4. But however, as temperature increases, then there's a change in the saturation levels, and as you can see, the normal line is at 38 degrees Celsius. At 43, the hemoglobin is a lot less saturated, and this is why you tend to find an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate, and all those things, because oxygen is more heavily demanded. Here we have some evidence of what happens in temperature and what happens in altitude.